So now we'll introduce our speaker for this evening. Many of you probably know Michael Mills or have heard of him. He's a well-known character on the African birding scene. Michael has a master's from the University of Cape Town, and he's written a number of books, I think notably The Birder's Guide to Africa, illustrated with the photographs of our president, Tasso Leventis. Michael is a freelance bird guide, mainly with Birding Africa, and he's been involved with Angola since 2005, and is now certainly considered one of, if not the authority on the birds of the country. He's been working on a number of conservation issues, in particular with the NGO, the Kasama Foundation, with support from Tasso Leventis, and in particular working on a site called Mount Moko, which I'm sure we'll hear about during the course of the talk this evening. And very pleased to say that he's also recently become the African Bird Club representative for Angola. So I'll hand over now to Michael and hear about birding and bird conservation in Angola. Thank you very much, Michael.
Thank you, Paul, and thanks to all of you who've taken the time to join in for my talk in Angola this evening. As you can see, it's birding and bird conservation in Angola. And I'll start off, well, the whole talk's illustrated with lots of photographs of the important birds, and I'll try and remember to give the names of each of the species that appear. But I'm going to start off with, well, firstly, this is the red-crested turco, which is Angola's national bird. It's endemic to Angola and certainly probably the most iconic bird for bird watchers coming to the country. Okay, just a brief overview first of the talk. I will start with an overview of Angola, general facts about the country, then look at biodiversity as a whole, starting with a physical template and then habitats and birds. And finally end off with a bird tour through Angola. I'll take you through our standard itinerary and the species we see at different sites and habitats. And then for the last 10 or so minutes, I'll talk specifically about the conservation projects that I've been involved with and some of the other projects going on in the country. This is an Angola lark on the right, a near endemic to Angola. So this is a map of Angola. It's very much the same size as South Africa, about 1.2 million square kilometers. The population is about half that of South Africa, 33 million. And the vast majority of the population is located in the west of the country. There's quite a big east-west divide, which will come up continually through my talk as a theme. And I'll illustrate that the difference in various ways. Angola lies within the tropics between 6 and 18 degrees south. So the entire country is pretty tropical. Then its colonial past is that it was a Portuguese colony. And probably the largest recent or the most significant recent event in Angola's history, unfortunately, was a very prolonged first independence war and then civil war, more or less from the mid-60s all the way to 2002. And this has left a major mark on the country, especially the social landscape. There is an entire generation of people who are pretty much uneducated, didn't have health services, except in Luanda and a few of the major cities. And then in terms of industry, Angola is very heavily oil dependent. 95% of foreign revenue is earned or was earned through oil. I don't know what the latest figure is, but it will be similar. It does have diamonds up in the northeast, but those were extracted primarily in the colonial period, so it's a relatively small revenue earner for them. In general, the economy is not very diversified. It used to be a big agricultural country, and there are projects starting up to try and resuscitate that sector of the economy, but it's happening slowly. So unfortunately, Angola is still very much dependent on oil, and since the oil price dropped, I think in about 14, 15, their economy has been struggling a lot. Okay, moving on to biodiversity. I don't know too much about soils myself, But this map illustrates one of the theme that I mentioned, the East-West divide, quite well in terms of diversity. So the western half, as you can see, has many different soil types. The eastern half is almost entirely covered in Kalahari sands that have been blown up. It's moister than what we think of as the Kalahari, so the habitat is not the same. It's mainly Miombo woodland, but these are very deep sands, sometimes up to 100 meters deep. And that means it's a very nutrient poor and uniform system. Whereas in the west, the topography varies a lot more and the soils are much more varied. And just to mention, this map comes from the book Biodiversity of Angola, which anyone interested in the country, I can recommend you Google it. It is available for free as a PDF download and covers all aspects of Angola, Angolan biodiversity. Okay, moving on to altitude and landform. There are 5 primary elements to Angola's geography. First is, well, starting in the west, there's a coastal plain which varies in width. The coastal plain lies below 300 meters altitude. It's arid throughout its length. Even Luanda in the north, it receives only about 450 millimeters of rainfall. And down in the south, it's the Nama Desert. So all of it's arid. Then moving inland, and the largest portion of the country is covered by a plateau, generally at around 1,000 meters in altitude. And that runs all the way across to Congo, Zambia in the east. The smaller elements are the highlands. Sorry, it's 4 elements, not 5. The highlands, as you can see, the red areas on the map, are a very important element. It's the largest, or the furthest outlying montane region of Africa. It's separated by 2,000 kilometers from any other Afro-montane areas on the continent. And this means that the species associated with those habitats are highly isolated in Angola and are evolving along their own trajectories and will eventually become separate species. And if we lose those species, we're losing that evolutionary potential. Then probably the greatest, or the element of greatest biological importance is the escarpment. And that is the interface between the plateau and the coastal plain. It varies in width. In the north, it's quite broad and it rises very gradually. Especially in the center and in parts of the south, it's very steep. At Lubango, you have a 1,000-meter vertical drop pretty much over, well, it's over about a kilometer. So incredibly impressive escarpments, and associated with this is moister habitat generally, caused by mists coming off the cold ocean current to the west and rains coming from the east. And so the escarpment is moister than the habitats either east or west of it. And it's created a bit of a corridor from the Congo Basin forests where species have moved down south, just along the escarpment. Probably the biggest break, the most important break in the escarpment is formed by the Kwanzaa River, which is Angola's largest river that rises and reaches the sea within the country. So the northern escarpment is quite different from the central escarpment, but I'll talk more about that a bit later. Then moving on to rainfall, most of the country is fairly moist, especially on the plateau, and in the highlands it's very wet, but it varies a lot. And in the southwest you have some of the driest deserts on the continent. So all this diversity in landform, in moisture, creates a great range of habitats. Angola, especially the highlands, are also very important for the drainages of several large rivers. This map shows the main drainage basins in southern Africa. And as you can see, you've got part of the Zambezi. A lot of the water from the headwaters of the Zambezi come out of Angola. In the northeast, the water drains into the Congo Basin. in these, virtually all the water drains out southeast into the, for the Okavango system drains out of Angola to the southeast, and then the Kunene system in the west. There are also quite a few rivers, as I mentioned, especially the Kwanzaa and the Keve, which rise in the highlands and flow straight towards the coast. So along the coast, there are some very significant wetlands, especially once it reaches the coastal plain and the rivers meander and spread out with lakes and so on. So moving on to habitats, this variation has driven different variation in habitats. Most of the country, though, is covered in broadleaf woodlands, and these woodlands are mostly associated with the Kalahari soils, so a very uniform soil type. So the grey is Miombo woodlands, and the orange in the southeast is a slightly drier broadleaf woodland dominated by Baikia. In the northeast, you have some moister Congo savanna type habitats. But again, the significant habitats are the Afromontane habitats, primarily grassland, still some forest, and then the escarpment habitats, which are moister thickets, especially along the rivers, and forest along the escarpment. And then in the southwest, you have proper deserts. So in terms of bird diversity and endemism, this is a map from my book, The Birder's Guide to Africa, showing the importance of different countries based only on the bird species that occur there. And as you can see, Angola ranks very highly. It's 7th. It has 960 species recorded, which is the 5th highest total for any African country. And it also has a relatively high degree of endemism. So at least 24 strict endemics and a whole bunch of other near endemics, which are of particular interest to visiting birders. Okay, so I'm now going to take you through our standard birding tour and the main birding sites, their habitats, and the species that occur there. But first, a bit of introduction to the tour. Its duration is 18 days of birding, and we typically spend 2 nights at a site and then move on. During that time, we typically record between 530 and 550 species. Which nicely illustrates how diverse it is. But there are many things about Angola that people don't realize have changed. And this comes especially to the infrastructure. In the last 15 years, great strides have been made in building up or revising the road infrastructure. In general, the roads are actually pretty good, above standard African quality. And the accommodation is surprisingly good. So most of the birding sites we visit, some are a bit trickier, but all the big towns basically have very comfortable air-conditioned accommodation. The hotels have their own generators, and anyone who's been is actually quite surprised by how comfortable it is. The other thing which has changed a lot, which is especially relevant to visiting birders, is the visa situation. It's now possible for almost any nationality to apply for a visa online and receive it within 48 hours of application. So access to the country is much, much easier than it was. Until about 5 or 6 years ago, it invariably took at least 2 to 3 weeks to get a visa. Okay, so sorry, I'm just going to flip back to the last image, just to give you some idea of where the locations are that we'll visit on this virtual tour. So we start off in Luanda, the capital. Almost all international flights arrive in Luanda. And we start off by going northeast to Bushreich in the northern escarpment. So these dark green patches that you can see on this Google Earth satellite image are the very moist northern escarpment forests. We then move southeastwards to the Kalandula Falls area, which lies in the Miombo belt, then cross back through the northern escarpment, cross the Kwanzaa River to the base of the central escarpment, which has a lot of the endemics at Kisama National Park. Then from there, we make our way down the coast to Megengela, get into some of the more arid habitats similar to Namibia, and on to Lubango, which is one of the most significant cities in the country down in the south. Lubango is an incredibly diverse area. It's up in the Highlands. You can get to over 2,000 meters by road. And then just to the west, you drop off very steeply to the arid coastal plain. And we then wind our way back through the Highlands at Mount Moko, the top of the Central Escarpment at Konda and Kumbira Forest, and back to Luanda. But I'll now highlight these sites. So Luanda, we don't spend too much time in. It's a big city, not too many birds, but there are some endemics that can be seen within a few hundred meters of downtown Luanda, including this redback mouse bird. And I should mention all these birds are featured in my book, The Special Birds of Angola, which highlights 70 of the most important birds in the country. And also this rufous-tailed palm thrush, which often nests on verandas. Almost any large garden in Luanda has these birds resident. The northern escarpment forest, as I mentioned, is lowland rainforest, but it's not as sticky and humid as typical lowland rainforest. We generally at around 800 meters altitude, so it's a bit cooler. These forests are an outlier of the Congo Basin forest, as I mentioned, and most of the birds are Congo Basin species. There are not too many endemics here, but there are two key species that we look for. This here is Angolan white-throated greenbill, which BirdLife has split based on the information I provided and the vocalizations. And this in fact is the first photo of the bird in the wild, so it's not often seen. Just a shot of some of the forest habitat. And then the star of the show here is bronze bushreich, which is endemic and endangered, localized to a very small area of the northern escarpment. Fortunately, its conservation status is reasonably good. There are not too many people living in the area, and it likes forest edge and tangles, so it's doing all right. And then this is Falkenstein's or Yellowneck greenbill, which is remarkably common. It's not endemic. You get it all the way up to southern Cameroon, but it is incredibly common along the escarpment and very easy to see, going down also to the central escarpment. Then from the northern escarpment forest across to Kalandula Falls area, which is a very pleasant mosaic of Miombo woodlands and gallery forest. And here the star of the show is this unusual white-headed robin chat. I say unusual because this is mostly a canopy species, which for a robin chat is very unusual. If you call it in, it always comes in high up in the canopy, and it can be quite a tricky species to see. This is Kalandula Falls, Angola's largest and best known waterfalls, one of the top tourist attractions. Then moving on to some Miombo woodland species, Anchiatus barbet, which also goes into Zambia and southern DRC, but it's an incredibly scarce bird, and Kalandula Falls is the only place that I've been to where I see it every time I go. So we do sometimes see it at Mount Moko and other places like that, but it seems to be especially common here. This is sharp-tailed starling, more or less, probably 80% of the range is in Angola, and this is the common starling on in the Miombo woodlands on the plateau. And Kalandula Falls is one of the best sites to see it. Then gorgeous bushreich, this one has been split before as perrins, which is it's sort of a Central African species. This occurs in the gallery forests around Kalandula. And then over the river bridges, you get large colonies of red-throated cliff swallows. Then we, as I mentioned, we cross back through the northern escarpment briefly, but head on to the lower central escarpment. And this area, the habitat doesn't look that amazing, but it consists primarily of dry forests and thickets, but it is incredibly high in endemic species diversity. This here is Montero's bushreich, endemic to Angola. I don't believe that the individuals that have been seen in Cameroon can be related to this. But it's fairly widespread in these dry thickets and forests around the base of the escarpment. This is some of the habitat, a lot of baobab trees. You get forests of baobabs, more baobabs than you'll see anywhere else in Africa. And then some of the other endemics are grey striped francolin, which is fairly widespread across the escarpment, but is far easier to see in the drier habitat with open patches than in any of the other habitats. This is pale olive greenbill, just goes over the border into the Congo. Gabella helmet shrike, one of the top birds of the country, very similar to Retz's, but smaller. And you can see how the very pale mantle contrasts with the black wings and the black head. So quite distinctive, but closely related to Retz's. White-fronted wattle-eye, which is a variation on the brown-throated wattle-eye theme. Also endemic to these in dry thickets. And then in the savannas, you get golden-backed bishop, which does occur in Santa May, but was introduced there. These birds, so our tours generally run at the end of the dry season. It's when most of the resident birds breed, August, September, early October. This is the one species that you won't see in its best dress. These birds breed basically from January to May. But even the non-breeding and female birds are quite distinctive. They've got these pale-edged feathers on the scapulars, a very lemon yellow eyebrow and throat, and a nice chestnutty wash on the breast. And these birds concentrate in big flocks along the main rivers when they're not breeding. Then we move on down the coast into some of the drier habitats in the south. And this area, ironically, has probably larger numbers and high densities of many of the Namibian endemic birds that people go to Namibia to see, like Hartlib's francolin, this white-tailed shrike, and then other things like Rupel's parrots, Montero's hornbills, Damara hornbill, all very common in this habitat. None of them endemic or can be seen in Namibia, but certainly Angola has diminished the birding importance of Namibia in that regard. Okay, then moving down to the far south of the country at Lubango. As I mentioned, there are two areas we visit. Firstly, there's Tundavala, which is high up in the highlands, over 2,000 meters in altitude. It has a variety of habitats, montane grasslands, a few patches of montane forest, and some nice rocky areas. And this bird here is the local form of white-headed barbet, which is also split by BirdLife, called white-bellied barbet. And it is a massive gap in the distribution. The closest birds are in central Tanzania. It is also the last endemic species to be rediscovered. It was only, I think it was refound in 2017, and it's only been seen 4 times, I think now. I've seen it twice. A colleague, a herpetological colleague of mine, rediscovered it, took some photos, wasn't sure what it was, and yeah, did a great job at finding the bird that the birders couldn't find. This is some of the habitat, beautiful grasslands. You get Denham's bustards, wailing cisticulars, wing-snapping cisticulars, etc. up here. And then these patches of gallery forest, well, Afromontane gallery forest. The starbird here, although there are only a couple of pairs, there are many more at Mount Moko, is the endemic endangered Suestris francolin. This is the rarest bird in terms of numbers of pairs that's endemic to Angola. Angola cave chat, which is known now from Namibia by a few pairs, but is pretty much endemic to Angola. And you can drive on a tar road and watch them from the comfort of your vehicle. They're so easy to see there. This is Angola Slatty Flycatcher, a typical montane species represented in East Africa and Ethiopia by white-eyed and Abyssinian Slatty flycatchers. It's the same genus and very close related. This occurs on forest edge, both here at Tundavala and at Mount Moko. Then we do a day trip into the coastal deserts, and it's an incredibly spectacular drive. You drop, as I mentioned, from 2,000 meters altitude all the way down almost to sea level. And the habitats get progressively drier. First, starting off once you hit the bottom in Mopani woodlands with a bit of gallery forest, going through sort of arid savannas, and then right out into some of the most arid deserts on the continent. This is Benguela long-billed lark. I'm not sure if it's a valid species. It might be the same as Karoo long-billed lark, but this is the site where it's most common. We see at least 10 or 15 in a day easily. Sorry, going the wrong way. Another interesting bird, this is split also by BirdLife, Benguela long-tailed starling split from Meave starling, and this occurs in the Mopani woodlands at the base of the escarpment. Very much a typical Meave starling in its calls and behavior and habitat preferences, but much less glossy and with completely different tones, purple and sort of a coppery gloss rather than the deep blue of Meave starling. Here's a photograph of the top of Lever Pass. Fortunately, there's a very nice tar road going down. Spectacular cliffs with Vero's eagles breeding on, black storks and so on. Lots of Bradfield swifts and alpine swifts. And then getting down, this is not exactly where we go, but these are some photos of the southern deserts. This is in fact in Iona National Park, some of the very arid savanna, and some lovely rocky mountain passes, very spectacular terrain. Then we start making our way back north towards Luanda, and one of my favorite sites in Africa, and my favorite site in Angola is Mount Moko, the greater region of Mount Moko. It is incredibly diverse. The mountain itself is the highest mountain in Angola, so it has some of the most important Afromontane forests remaining. Most of the area is covered on the mountain is covered in highland grasslands, but the greater area is covered in Miombo woodland, and there are numerous drainage lines with what we call dambos, the open grasslands, moist open grasslands associated with the drainage lines. This is Bockage's sunbird, more or less endemic to Angola. It does go just into DRC. And this is a species that occurs in these dambos running through Miombo woodland. This is a photograph of the mountain, and I'll talk more about this from a conservation perspective later, but you can see a couple of very small patches of Afromontane forest this side. The main patch is just the other side of the mountain, but it's quite a long walk. And most of the area open grasslands with some protea bushes scattered about. Some of the Miombo woodlands with the dambo running through, really beautiful terrain. And moving on to some of the star birds in the forests, this is Margaret's batis, which was first described from Mount Moko and is an endemic subspecies to the Angolan Highlands. It does occur in Zambia. It's probably a little bit easier to see in Zambia, but this is one of the key birds at Mount Moko. Bockage's akalat also goes across into the Mashitu forests in Zambia. Western green tinkerbird, here represented by an endemic subspecies, and a big outlier. The closest birds are probably in Cameroon. Blackface Canary, which is more widespread, but it's quite common at Mount Moko, also along the Escarpment, and also not strictly endemic, but definitely one of the specials. Then this bird here was overlooked for a long time. It was described as a subspecies of rock-loving cisticola, but the very first time I heard it, I knew it could not be a rock-loving cisticola. We managed to get some genetic samples, and it is not related at all to rock-loving cisticola. BirdLife has split it as Huambo cisticola, and I'm going to play the call for you now. So anyone who knows rock-loving cisticola knows that this is completely atypical, something very different. It seems to be closely related to short-winged cisticola, and some of the tones you can hear there are quite similar. This is black-collared bulbul, also more widespread, but special at Mount Moko. Fullerborne's longclaw, which occurs in the dambo grasslands of Central Africa, but is common in the Mount Moko region. Very similar to yellow-throated, but lacking those black streaks on the side of the chest, and a bit bigger. And this is Brothers Martin, which was prior to 2005, not known from the Angolan Highlands at all. It was regarded as an entirely restricted to the Congo Basin. And on a 3-month visit to Angola in 2005, I was driving through the Highlands. I stopped at a river crossing and I heard a strange call coming through my window, hopped out, and there was a pair of brothers martins sitting on a grass stalk singing. They were about 800 kilometers out of range. And we now know that there's a small breeding population. They seem to only come at the end of the dry season, so sort of August to October, and then they move off again. But they breed in the Angolan Highlands. Bockage's weaver, which is almost endemic to the country, just comes into northwest Zambia. And then some more widespread birds like the lovely locust finch, black and rufous swallow, actually not much more widespread. It also just gets into northwest Zambia and southern DRC. We're still at sunbird, very similar to white-bellied sunbird, quite different calls though, and it's got this band of maroon below the blue. Salvadoris eremomola here on the right, which I personally think is just a subspecies of yellow-bellied, but it has quite extensive yellow below and a bit of an olivey tinge to the mantle. The calls sound the same, but Mount Mocha is a good area to see it. Then the lovely black-collared eremomola, a fairly scarce bird, not often seen. Okay, and moving on now to our final site, one which I'll revisit in the conservation part of the talk too. And this is Kumbira Forest and the upper central escarpment. This is the most significant site in the country for bird conservation, I believe. There are 3 endangered endemic species that occur in the dry Congolian forest here. So the central escarpment is more disconnected from the Congo Basin. It has a lower species diversity, far fewer Congo Basin birds, but a higher level of endemism because it is isolated. This is Pulitzer's longbill, which is endangered. Red-crested turco, the national bird, as I mentioned, is common at Kumbira. It is more widespread along the escarpment, but this is the best site to see it. Fortunately, it's not endangered. This is Gabella acalat, which of all Angola's endemics has the narrowest range. It occurs in an area of about 50, 60 kilometers north-south and 10 kilometers east-west. Fortunately, it can survive in small patches of habitat, so it's still quite common, but it is endangered, based mainly on range size and declining population. Gabella Bushreich, this is the central escarpment endemic about which I'm most concerned. At Kumbira Forest, it used to be, when I first started going there in 2005, 2003, 2005, it was not a bird I had to look for, you just saw them. And in 2010, I did a survey and we recorded them. We did a survey of 200 point counts in Kumbira Forest. I recorded them at 20 different sites. And for my last 5 visits to Kumbira, I have not found one. So they've undergone a massive decline. I'm quite concerned about the species. So endangered, if not critically endangered based on declines, and endemic to a fairly small area of the central escarpment. This is another fairly recently recognized endemic, split by BirdLife. It's called pale-throated barbet, very close related to naked-faced barbet, but it's also a species I'm concerned about. Also a bird which I didn't have to look for at Kumbira. It was quite common, and it's becoming rarer and rarer, and I can only find 2 colonies of them now. In some more common endemics, this is Hearthead's Cameroptera. I'm not sure if it's a good species either. It's got the combination of a grey back and a green tail, which sets it apart from green-backed and grey-backed Cameroptera. Yellow-bellied wattle-eye, which is quite widespread in Africa, but I think it is probably more common and easy to see at Kumbira than any other place I've ever visited. Forest scrub robin, which is also quite widespread. It has an unusual distribution in Africa, mainly, occurring in the Upper Guinea region, in the east of the Congo Basin, and then along the Angolan escarpment. In most places, it's very rare, but here along the Angolan escarpment, it's actually quite common. Always difficult to see, but a very distinctive and beautiful song, which you hear often. Then Angola batis, not endemic, goes into Gabon, but by far the main part of the population is in Angola. And then as a bit of an aside, this is Angola's newest larger mammal. It's a species of bush baby, which I discovered in 2005, sound recorded and sent to the World Authority on Nocturnal Primates. And Simon Bearder and some of his colleagues came out, and we did a 2-week field trip to confirm that this is a different species, and it's named after Kumbira Forest, where I first found it. So Galagoides kumbirensis. Okay, moving on to conservation. First, a quick look at the protected area network as it currently stands. So most of these parks were set up during the colonial period, and mainly for hunting and large mammals. So you will remember that the Angolan Highlands are here, and that the escarpment runs through this region. And from a bird point of view, those are the 2 most important habitat types, the 2 most threatened habitat types probably in the country, and entirely unprotected by the current conservation area network. Talking about general conservation projects, there are very few in the country. The 2 most successful and best known projects are the giant sable project. Giant sable is an endemic subspecies of sable and the country's national mammal. And a good friend of mine, Pedro Vaspinto, has run a very successful project getting them breeding in Kangandala and Luanda national parks. Then also the second most significant project probably is a turtle breeding conservation project, working with local communities to protect breeding beaches along the coast at various sites, but the main site has been Rio Longa. And this is a project that's been going on for at least 18 years. Then my own 2 projects, most active projects, I've done other work too, but are at Kumbira and Mount Moko, and I'll talk a bit about those 2 after this. And then just to highlight the other 2 highest priorities to me are the Number Mountains, which hold the most Afromontane forest left in the country, 600 hectares. At Mount Moko, there's 100 hectares, or even around 85 hectares. So it's an incredibly threatened habitat. The Number Mountains was not really known to hold large patches of forest. And in 2010, I did an expedition in there based on satellite imagery, and we discovered all the threatened Afromontane forest birds were still common there, some of which are now extinct at Moko. So numbers are high priority. Fortunately, it's a very tough terrain to move through, and no one lives right next to the forest. So it's naturally quite well protected. And then the northern escarpment, which has the other endemic birds, not as threatened as the central escarpment forest, but a high conservation priority. And the good news is that the Angolan government has recognized 3 priorities: the northern escarpment, Kumbira, and Mount Moko, for expanding the conservation area network. And I'm working with colleagues from Kisama Foundation on Kumbira and Mount Moko to try and get reserves established here. And we're fairly long, a fairly long way through that process. Okay, so just to highlight some of the conservation threats, and I guess they're typical of most countries, but I think the severity is slightly higher in Angola. Lack of capacity is a big one. As I mentioned, the war meant there was a whole generation of people who didn't have a good education. There's a lack of prioritization of the importance of conservation, and I understand that because the country had gone through 30 years of war, and the priority was to rebuild the infrastructure and earn money through oil extraction. So the focus has not been on conservation. There is a big lack of law enforcement. I think the police force don't even know what the environmental laws are. The environmental laws are actually quite good, but they're just not enforced. Commercial logging is a problem in the northern escarpment forests. It's a bit of a free-for-all. Lots of big operations going on there, and that's the biggest threat to the northern escarpment forests. In general, over-dependence on natural resources. So a lot of the population lives a rural existence, and they rely very heavily on the environment. Slash and burn agriculture is a particularly large problem on the Central Escarpment. And then the bushmeat trade, which throughout northern Angola, it doesn't seem to be practiced as much in the south, but it's very widely practiced. Just about everyone has a gun following the war. So just some photos illustrating this. This is charcoal production. So chopping down of woodlands, primarily Miombo. This is not a Miombo, but large parts of the Miombo woodland are being chopped down for charcoal. Most people of, I think there are 8 million people in Luanda. The vast majority of those don't have electricity and cook on charcoal. So it's the charcoal gets shipped to the large cities. This is a photograph up near Mount Moko, looking at agricultural expansion, and the woodlands on the higher mountains and rocky parts are the best protected, but people are working their way up the slopes. Bushmeat, as I mentioned, when you drive in the north of the country, for sale along the roadside, very commonly. Okay, now to move on to my main projects. I have been involved in a whole bunch of general bird research, visiting different sites, but my focus latterly has been very much on trying to establish conservation projects at Mount Moka and Kumbira Forest. And these sites were identified based on surveys done in 2005 during a 3-month visit to identify the most important sites for the Central Escarpment birds and the montane birds. And from 2010, more or less, I've started to do some work at these sites. The Mount Moka project is by far the most advanced. It's a much simpler situation to deal with, but just to highlight the problem, these are comparative photos from the 1970s and from now of the same patch of forest. And you can see that the vast majority of that patch of forest has gone. And that's repeated in all these sort of 15 to 20 forest patches on Mount Moko. The problem that I've identified is that the forest edge structure was changed by people chopping trees. And that has allowed grass and fires to burn into the forests. So currently, wood extraction from the forest is very low, but the forests are still getting hammered by grass and fires. And to deal with that, our main focus of the work that we're doing has shifted from actually planting trees to using fire breaks to protect forests. This is a photograph of the largest patch of forest left on the mountain. It's 18 hectares in size. And as you can see, some of these bits of forest are disappearing, turning into bracken bed. As the fires burn repeatedly, they keep burning further and further into the forests. So stopping these grass and fires is very important. This is a satellite image looking down on the mountain. This is that same patch of forest here in the center of the mountain, as you can see, by far the largest patch. All the forests are pretty much restricted to the main drainages off the mountain. This here in the center of the mountain is the largest drainage, but all the forest there has been burnt. Most of the forest is on very steep slopes, so that gives it some protection, but this valley is broader and more open, and all of that forest has been lost. So as I mentioned, initially we started off planting trees, working with the local community. We have a very good working relationship. Fortunately, the social situation is fairly simple. There's only one community right at the foot of the mountain that directly utilizes the resources, and there are about 500 people in that community. So over 10 years, we've established an incredibly good working relationship with them. They're very much on board with the project, and we provide employment through the project, employing people to run our nursery, well, the project's nursery when we're absent, and paying big teams of people to plant trees and also to put in fire breaks. So this is some of the team at work here. The project, the tree growing project has been fairly slow, but it's been increasing. In the last season, we planted 500 trees, and the nursery now holds about 2,000 trees. And we're planning on expanding that all the time. But as I say, our focus now is on protecting the forest with fire breaks. And as you can see, in this image here, taken from a drone, you can see this line in the upper part here, which is a fire break, which we cut in by hand. It's incredibly labor intensive, and we now have raised funds. The execution of the project has been set back by COVID, but the plan is to get a professional fire trainer up here and to equip a team of 20 fire managers to use fire to control fire, so to burn fire breaks. And that, we believe, will allow us to protect all the forest patches on the mountain in about 10 days of work. Our initial fire breaks have proven to be very successful at stopping fires. There have been at least 5 or 6 fires stopped that would have knocked the habitat back, probably 5 years of growth lost. So setting up these fire breaks is very important. As I mentioned, many of the communities in Angola are very heavily dependent on natural resources, and so are the people at Mount Moko. All cooking is done on wood collected. Fortunately, now the wood is generally collected from Miombo woodlands, but people are still living a very heavily resource-dependent life, and part of our work is to try and reduce their reliance on natural resources by introducing alternatives, both technologies and alternative sources of wood and so on. Just a photograph of a village meeting, talking about the project, talking about conservation and so on. This is a shot, just for good measure, of the Number Mountains. So as I mentioned, 600 hectares remaining of Afro-montane forest here, 85 hectares at Mount Moko, and we don't know of any other sites with more than 10 or 15 hectares. Then moving on to Kumbira briefly. Kumbira is much more complex. There are many communities living in this valley. This is a photograph over Kumbira Forest taken in 2003 on my first visit to the country. And it was almost wall-to-wall forest, one side of the valley to the other. But as I mentioned, lots of people living in the area. There's mixed land usage, so some community land and some privately owned farms, which are not really functioning farms, just people holding title deeds. And so dealing with the situation here has been much harder. We've done extensive surveys in these forests, both of habitat structure and bird distributions, especially the endemics within the forest. So we understand the situation quite well. We've engaged communities and schools around issues of conservation. Kisama Foundation has published a children's book set in Kumbira Forest using the Turako, red-crested Turako as a character, and the bush baby, and introduced those into the schools. So far it's been mainly studying and environmental awareness. And we're now hoping, and I must say that we're very fortunate that the Rainforest Trust is interested in getting involved here. We've just finished a feasibility study with them. And the plan is to purchase some land to set some of the farms and set those aside as either as a private reserve, or if the government is interested, which it does seem to be, is for it to become part of an official protected area. In line with that, I should mention too that Mount Moko is set to become a conservation area, and thanks to the African Bird Club, they've engaged the World Land Trust, and we're in the early phases of talking to them about funding for setting up a reserve at Mount Moko. So things are definitely moving in the right direction. Just to illustrate some of the problems at Kumbira, this is Slashenberg agriculture. Probably 70% of the habitat at Kumbira has been lost in the last 15 years. And another problem this photo actually illustrates is that there's a highly invasive tree that was planted as part of the shade coffee plantations here, Inga edulis from South America. And any area that has been disturbed gets heavily invaded. So these trees here in the back, fortunately, this was slash and burnt Inga forest, but it is a conservation problem here too that we need to try and address. Okay, thank you very much. I must thank various individuals, and especially from the conservation side, Tasso Leventis has been incredibly supportive of the work. He's been supporting it for over 10 years now. We've put in applications and received funding also from DP Conservation Leadership Program, and at Kumbira and at Mount Moko, the Rufford Foundation. They've been especially good to us. And then a whole bunch of people specifically for this presentation who have shared their photographs with me. Thank you very much. If anyone wants to contact me, that's my email address. And I think we're probably ready to take questions if anyone has any.
Thank you very much, Michael. Stunning photographs and a really, really fascinating talk. Certainly, I think good to hear that. I think it does still have a reputation as being quite a difficult country to visit. So really good to hear that things have become easier. And I'm sure quite a lot of us will have mentally put the country a little bit higher on our must-go-to lists as a result of your talk.
Mm.
As I said earlier, if you want to ask any questions, maybe you can just pop them into the chat box. We've got a couple, Michael, to kick things off. One, Laura Brown, and do stay muted, everybody. Just to. One from Laura Brown, who asked how much of the revenue from the tours, the bird tours that take place in Angola, goes into to sort of towards local communities. And I guess by an extension to that question, what's the potential for expanding the kind of local community benefits from wildlife tourism in the future?
Yeah, look, until now, very little. So I've been very concerned about introducing sources of revenue into communities before we've established a very good relationship with them, because I think it often causes conflict within communities when there's funds coming in and it's not clear how it will be shared. This is something we're definitely working towards. So with the work I do, I put an extra 30% of all salaries paid into a community fund. And I've had quite a few people on tour with me contribute to that fund too. So those are voluntary contributions. When the reserves are set up, the plan is, certainly at Mount Moko, is that there will be an entry fee charged, and that will go to the local community, or at least be used in projects with the local community. I think that's a better alternative than just to handing over the money, because generally the chief and his cronies end up keeping all the money for themselves. So we would like to work with the community on projects that they identify as important and fund those. And we've already done that to some degree. So from the community fund, we've paid for a new school roof, and we've started a deworming campaign in the village. It was identified as a health issue.
Great, thank you. And a couple of linked questions. I think one question: how you talked a bit about the bird declines at Kumbira and sort of how bad things are at Kumbira right now. And thinking of both Kumbira and Mount Moko, you know, what difference do you think protected area status would make to those areas if it can be achieved? Whether that's whether that's a formal protected area or some kind of purchase or lease.
So I think from a conservation point of view, a strictly conservation point of view, at Mount Moko, having an official protected area won't make too much difference, except that the government will be more interested in it. And it will probably be easier to raise funds to manage it. But we've got such a good working relationship with the community that I think we could roll out the same conservation measures without a formal conservation area. At Kumbira, it's a different situation. There are too many people living in that area for working with communities to be a feasible option. So we need to buy land, which is currently privately owned. Well, strictly speaking, the government owns the land, but the use rights are owned by individuals. So this is what we've been looking at with the Rainforest Trust. They're very keen to purchase some land, and as I mentioned, we've just done a feasibility study. So here the aim would be to set up either a private reserve or a government reserve based on some farm purchases, and then to work with communities around that to reduce their impacts. So to have core habitat strictly protected and general landscape management working with communities.
Thanks, Michael. Got a question about birding tours. Do you know, this may be a question you can't easily answer, but which international or local birding tour companies run tours to Angola? I guess probably none at the moment, but
yeah, none for the last 2 years. So I've been doing birding tours for Birding Africa since 2005. BirdQuest have run several trips, and Rock Jumper have done a couple. I think those are the only. So we also, the tourism industry is picking up, and I really see Angola as the biggest untapped birding tourism destination in Africa. Last year, well, in previous years, so up until 2019, we've only ever had one trip per year. Last year, we had 4 tours booked, confirmed. I think 3 of the 4 were full, and the other one was almost full. So Angola is definitely growing in reputation as a birding destination, and it's been recognized as that. And hopefully, going forward, we can be running 15 to 20 tours at least quite soon between the different companies, and that can actually provide a good revenue stream for some of these projects. Yeah.
And presumably local kind of bird guides and companies and things will follow that when that starts.
Yeah, probably. There is a bit of, yeah, there is a project at the moment, not one I'm very fond of, but an individual has come in. I don't want to get too much into the politics, but he's doing some bird guide training at different sites. Unfortunately, he thought you could train someone in 2 weeks to be a bird guide. So instead of training 20 people for a year properly, he's trained 200 people each for 2 weeks, which I think is a complete waste of time. But there's something happening. So we use, for our tours, we use a local operator, a local ground operator. They do all the logistics and provide very comfortable vehicles for us. But there are no bird tour guides anywhere living in the country. Yeah. So, sorry, one thing that is, so most of the people who would potentially be site guides are very rural, live a very rural existence, and they don't speak a word of English. So it's all Portuguese, and even in some places, not much Portuguese, just local languages. So I think that is a big obstacle to getting local guides involved. Most people just won't be able to communicate with them.
Thanks, Michael. There's a question about bushmeat, whether you know whether there's been any change in the last year or so. I maybe that nobody knows, but with the economic pressures facing everybody, but in particular local communities, whether that is something that's got worse.
The short answer is we don't know. I imagine it couldn't get much worse than it was. Basically, there's zero law enforcement related to that. And so everywhere you go in the north, there are plenty of hunters. Yeah. Okay. That's the one thing about Angola is you see virtually no mammals when you're traveling around. You might see 10 species of mammal in the 2.5 weeks, and most of them are couple of monkeys and a hyrax and maybe a mongoose or something. You just don't see large stuff walking around anywhere.
Got a birdie question for you. This is going up to the northern enclave of Cabinda. I understand there was a record of a Shelley's eagle owl. I'm just wondering if you knew anything more about that, whether that's been seems extraordinary, but has it been validated?
So there's sound recordings of it. It sounds very good, and the observer was Chris Hines, who's quite a good birder. Yeah, I don't doubt that it's correct. The problem with Kumbira is it's very unsafe to visit. There's a strong separatist movement. Anyone who remembers the African Cup of Nations football tournament that was hosted in Angola, I think it was the Benin football team bus that was attacked by separatists and several people were killed. So it is a very dangerous place. There was a small window. They've set up a new park there in the Mayombe Forest, Mayombe National Park, in the inland portion. And there was a lodge built, and it was operational for a very short time. I don't exactly know how long. And Chris managed to get in there just in a lucky gap. So I've been trying to get in there with Pedro Vespinto, the giant sable guy. He's been trying to organize it now for 2 or 3 years for us to go. And it just is incredibly logistically difficult. So you would need proper security on the ground. You would need to go with people who really know what they're doing. And the lodge has since closed down. So the Shelley's Eagle Hour was in fact in the lodge grounds. It's very frustrating, but the lodge is closed down. Yeah. And so there've been virtually no bird watchers or biologists going in there at all. It is a site, an area we're really trying to get into.
Maybe final couple of questions, quick questions, Michael. I think this is going back to Kumbira really, where you mentioned the very rapid declines, for example, from the Bushreich. Do you think that's solely due to habitat loss, or is there something else perhaps going on as well?
Yeah, I think it's solely due to habitat loss. Yeah, I don't think there's anything else really happening. The other birds, so the Bushreich likes well tangled, lots of lianas, but inside pretty good forest. It's not like a bronze or Luda's Bushreich, which occurs on forest edge. You pretty much get it in forest in dense tangles. And those lianas, when an area is cleared for agriculture, those lianas are always chopped down. So even if you get a dense growth coming back, it doesn't seem to be suitable for the Bushreichs. Yeah. I am hopeful though that if we can get, so I found them at a site very close to Kumbira, not in the original area we surveyed, which is in fact on one of the properties that we're hoping to purchase. So we know that there's still some birds in the area, and I think if we can secure a patch of an area of forest, that they will come back. We just need the forest to regrow, which it will do naturally.
Thank you. I'll take the prerogative of the final very quick question. I'm not. You may have said this, Michael, but when do the tours run? What's the best time to visit Angola? When do the tours run at a particular time, or is it always? I'm sure it's always good, but
yeah, there is very much a peak season, and that's August to October. Most of the resident birds breed then. Obviously the Palearctic migrants are not really in yet. You get a few if you do a trip at the end of October, but that's not the focus. And especially in the Highlands, most of the birds breed in the dry season. It's incredibly high rainfall and it gets very misty, and I think it dampens insect activity. So in the Miombo woodlands especially, and in the montane habitats, breeding is very strong in August, September, and then even by October, like most of the Bockage's weaver colonies are already deserted by October. Yeah. If you want to see golden-backed bishop in breeding plumage, then sort of March, April, May is good. But so one problem is access to sites. It's, as I mentioned, it's a lot of the areas high rainfall. We go on some narrow tracks, which are fine when it's dry, but when it's wet, you can get stuck going into Mocha, and Kumbira can be completely impossible.
I will just ask you this one last question because it's an important one. George Lelek has asked if we want to donate to Kumbira Forest Conservation, where do we send the money?
Thank you. Yeah. So I should have mentioned too that African Bird Club is coming on board not just with bringing funding partners on board, but they've put on the African Bird Club website, there is now, I think it's under Shop Mount Moko project, there is a donations box there that you can donate through. And especially if you're a British taxpayer, then there's the additional advantage of gift aid. So African Bird Club has already received funds on behalf of, it's mainly the Mount Moko project, but yeah, any funding would be greatly appreciated, and it would probably mostly be used to fund community work at those sites.
Yeah, so obviously, thank you. We would encourage people to support that. If you really want to support Kumbira, I guess that the Rainforest Trust will also be pleased to receive donations. I don't know whether that's specifically up and running yet for.
No, it's not. So, no, we just, so as I mentioned, we just finished the feasibility project. I'm busy working on that report, but hopefully within 12 months we'll have a full project going.
Yeah. So donate for Moko now on the African Bird Club website. For Kumbira, probably just hold off and keep an eye on things with the Rainforest.
Probably best to hold off. Yeah, you're always welcome to contact me too. We can make a plan. Thank you. Yeah. And if you have any other questions that you haven't had a chance to ask now, feel free to drop me an email.
Thanks, Michael. I think we'll stop there. And that's been a great evening. Thank you very much for the talk. Much appreciated. I'm sure we're all virtually clapping you and applauding you, even if you can't hear. So thanks very much, and thanks everyone for joining our first of these. As I said, 15th of June, Zimbabwe. We'll notify members and put something on the website nearer the time. So thank you very much, everybody. Wish you enjoy the rest of your evenings. Some of you have more evening left than others, but I hope it's a good one, and I hope everyone stays healthy and safe. Thanks again, Michael. Thanks, everybody. Goodbye.
Thanks, Paul. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Great presentation.